The Tomorrowverse is a series of DC animated movies that are all set in the same universe, or rather the same multiverse, which began in 2020 with the release of the universe's namesake, Superman, Man of Tomorrow. Since then has added the likes of Justice Society World War II, Batman The Long Halloween Parts 1 and 2, Green Lantern Beware My Power, and most recently Legion of Superheroes, as well as the upcoming Justice League Warworld. I made a video going over every superhero who has appeared in this universe, and now in this video I'll be going over every villain who has appeared as well. Legion of Superheroes is the most recent and the most relevant movie, so much like the Heroes video, which I do recommend you watch first, I'll be going in reverse order, starting with Legion of Superheroes just because it's the most relevant, and ending with Superman, Man of Tomorrow. This video does contain spoilers for Legion of Superheroes, as well as every other movie in the Tomorrowverse, so make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's begin. Oh, actually, before Legion of Superheroes, or rather after, there's Justice League Warworld, which I didn't talk about, by itself in the Heroes video, but I did speculate about characters who probably will be appearing, like basically all the members of the Justice League. Similarly, the title Warworld suggests that Mongol will be the main villain, and although it's unconfirmed, we can assume that he will be appearing, and probably in the main villain role. Legion of Superheroes was by far the movie which introduced the most heroes, but things are very different for this video, as just 4 villains were introduced in this movie, as opposed to the almost 40 heroes who were introduced. None of them were the main villain actually, as the main villain wasn't introduced in this movie, but actually in a previous movie, and I'll get to him later. All the villains introduced in this movie are inhabitants of Earth 1. First of all, there's Mon-El. He's played by Spider-Man and Ben 10 voice actor Yuri Lowenthal, and is kind of like the secondary main villain of the movie, but much more importantly, he is the twist of the movie, because Largand, aka Mon-El, and also sometimes known as Valor, is 100% a hero in the comics and member of the Legion of Superheroes. On top of that, the marketing of the movie, like the posters and the trailers, pointed towards him being a part of a trio of main characters alongside Supergirl and Brainiac 5. Even before the twist, I never felt like it was the case, but the twist obviously confirmed what his role is actually gonna be in this movie. This is, however, starting to become a pattern. This is nowhere near the first time the Tomorrowverse has used a hero as a villain. In fact, it's the 3rd time. This is, however, the first time a hero was an actual villain, as previously there was Aquaman who was mind-controlled, or Hal Jordan who was possessed. This is the first time that actually turned a hero into a villain, but the 3rd time they used a hero as a villain. It's definitely a pattern that they started. The other villains introduced in this movie are all of the Brainiacs between the first one, who was introduced in a previous movie, and number 5, who is a hero. There's Brainiac 2, voiced by Ben Diskin, Brainiac 3, voiced by Zeno Robinson, as well as Brainiac 4, voiced by Robbie Daymond. All 3 died by the end of the movie and are not likely to ever be seen again. I say unlikely even though they are dead, because, well, for one, this is a comic book world and people come back all the time in the comics, but also, the original Brainiac, the main villain of this movie, who was introduced in a previous movie, also died in that previous movie before coming back a couple years later. I'll get back to him when I get to the movie he was introduced in. Before Legion of Superheroes was Green Lantern Beware My Power, and every villain introduced in this movie is associated with the Sinestro Corps, or at the very least is in this movie, not necessarily in the comics. They are all also inhabitants of Earth 1. There are some minor ones who didn't have any lines, and thus no voice actors, including this unidentified character who I can't pinpoint, so let me know in the comments down below if you know who it is. Then there's Laura Damon, who is a very minor Teen Titans villain in the comics and was killed in this movie. There's also 2 Justice League villains who are used as members of the Sinestro Corps, including Kanjaro, who doesn't have any lines, as well as Despero, who is actually a major Justice League villain around from nearly the very beginning and also doesn't have any lines. I must say this is a very unusual take on these characters, where they're basically used as henchmen for the Sinestro Corps, and while they do manage to survive the events of the movie, and maybe we'll see them again, potentially in Justice League Warworld, for this one movie it's a very unusual take on these characters, and a very toned down take on both of them, especially Despero. Like, Despero could be a very cool villain in his own right, and now he's just a lineless henchman for Sinestro. It's not what he typically is. There are actual members of the Sinestro Corps from the comics who are members of the Sinestro Corps in the comics who debuted in this movie, like Arkillo, who also doesn't have any lines and doesn't survive to the end, as well as Lysa Drac, who's a rarity in this movie, being the only Sinestro Corps member who's a member in the comics, survives the movie, and has actual lines, as she's played by Mara Junot. On the other hand, there's Sinestro. He's voiced by Rick Wasserman. He's the secondary main villain of the movie and the leader of the Sinestro Corps, but much like a lot of characters in this movie, he does die, this time at the hands of Jon Stewart. Sinestro's death, alongside Hal Jordan, the rest of the Green Lantern Corps, and many more characters in previous movies, show how willing the Tomorrowverse is to kill important characters who, in most other comic book worlds, would be mostly untouchable, like Hal Jordan and Sinestro. Then there's the actual main villain of the movie, who was also the main villain of the live-action movie, Parallax, and while in his true form he doesn't have any lines and probably can't even speak, he's voiced by Nolan North whenever he's possessing Hal Jordan, which does take up most of his screen time, so in essence Nolan North does voice Parallax. And it's in that human form that he's destroyed by Jon Stewart. Hal Jordan being possessed is the second time the Tomorrowverse uses a mind-controlled hero as a villain, after Aquaman, and then it's followed by Mon-El, who again wasn't mind-controlled, he was turned into a villain, but it is 3 instances of a hero being used as a villain in the Tomorrowverse. There's clearly a pattern here, although unlike Aquaman and unlike Mon-El, Hal Jordan calling himself Parallax and being used as a major villain isn't something the Tomorrowverse just made up, as it's an actual story in the comics called Emerald's Twilight, which changed the status quo of the Green Lantern Corps for like 10 years. Moving backwards from there brings us to Constantine House of Mystery, which is a short that's seemingly set in the Tomorrowverse, and it's a direct sequel to Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, where Constantine is punished by the universe for messing with the timeline. A large portion of that punishment involves demons. There are unnamed demons who disguise themselves as Zatanna, Etrigan, and the rest of Constantine's friends, but then there are also named demons who show up at some point in the short and are villains in the comics. There's Beelzebub, played by Grey Griffin, Ashox, played by Damian O'Hare, and Nergal, who's basically Constantine's arch-enemy, and he's played by Robin Atkin Downes. They all appear in the same scene, and none of them are the main villains, as there isn't really a main villain in this short aside from, like, the universe. And speaking of the universe, it's not clear which universe this short takes place in, whether it's Earth 1, where Constantine is originally from, or Earth 2, where the Spectre is originally from, but just by default, especially since there's also Zatanna and Etrigan, we can't assume that it takes place on Earth 1, but at the same time, with these villains being demons from Hell, it's possible that they and the rest of Hell are outside of the concept of the multiverse, and let's say there's only one heaven and one hell in existence, so for these characters specifically, I don't think the universe they're from really matters. Then there's Batman The Long Halloween, which I didn't really talk about for very long in the Heroes video, but these movies, or more specifically Part 1, are by far the biggest source of villain debuts in this universe, as a lot of the Batman Rogues Gallery as well as crime family related characters debuted in this movie. All the characters introduced in The Long Halloween exist on Earth 1, or at least did exist because a lot of them have died. The only one of these characters to be introduced in Part 2 is Sophia Falcone, who's played by Layla Burzins and did die by the end of the movie. Part 1 introduced 14 villains, many of whom are now deceased members of the Falcone crime family, including Carmine Falcone, played by Titans Lex Luthor actor Titus Welliver, who appeared in both parts and died in Part 2, Alberto Falcone, played by Jack Quaid, who died in and only appeared in Part 1, as well as Sal Maroni, played by Jim Peary, who also appeared in both parts, but died in Part 2. The rest of the villains all appeared in and survived both parts, so I don't have to mention it like every time. There's Batman's archenemy, the Joker, played by Troy Baker, who clearly already has an established path with Batman, who is in his second year, which is also true for almost all of the Batman Rogues Gallery members who appear in this movie, aside from Two-Face, who becomes Two-Face in these movies. Then there's Jervis Tetch, aka the Mad Hatter, played by John DiMaggio, who actually plays the Joker in another animated movie, Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, played by DC veteran David Dastmalchian, who plays another villain in this movie, and a lot of different DC and Marvel characters, Pamela Isley, aka Poison Ivy, played by Katie Sackhoff, Jonathan Crane, aka Scarecrow, played by Robin Atkin Downes, as well as Solomon Grundy. Grundy is played by Fred Tatasciore in The Long Halloweens and by Darren DePaul in Legion of Superheroes. Now that he's appeared in Legion of Superheroes, his third movie, he's the villain who's appeared in the most amount of movies in this universe, and interestingly enough, ties with Superman, Batman, and The Flash for the most appearances in the Tomorrowverse. Then there are the big players of these movies and the Long Halloween story in general outside of the Falcone crime family. There's Julian Day, aka Calendar Man, played by David Dastmalchian as well. There's Harvey Dent, aka Two-Face, who becomes Two-Face during the events of these movies, and is played by Josh Duhamel. And then there's his wife, Gilda Dent, also known as Holiday, who is maybe the main villain of these movies and is played by Julie Nathanson. There's also Joe Chill, the man who killed Thomas and Martha Wayne, who appears in a flashback, as well as Selena Kyle, aka Catwoman, who I'm not actually including as one of the villains because she's become more of an anti-hero or even kind of a straight-up hero in the comics, and is 100% a good guy in these movies, but considering her villainous status for years, I thought I'd at least mention her. And finally, for the Long Halloweens, are two villains who are mentioned but are never shown, which at least confirms they exist in the Tomorrowverse and have a past with Batman, but we may never ever see them in this universe. These two villains are Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc, and Drury Walker, aka Killer Moth, so the two killers of the Batman Rogues Gallery. Before we get to Justice Society World War II, there's the short Kamandi the Last Boy on Earth, which all evidence points to taking place in the far future of Earth 2, which I explain in depth in the Heroes video. Most of the antagonists who appear in this short are nameless cannon fodder, aside from this one monkey guy whose name is Zuma. The villains of this short really don't matter though, so there's no point in dwelling on this any longer. That brings us to Justice Society World War II, which, much like Legion of Superheroes, introduced many more heroes than villains, but that's not the only connection between the two movies. Vril Dox, aka Brainiac, exists on Earth 1 and is played by Darren DePaul, and he appeared for the first time in Justice Society World War II at the very beginning and then at the very end of the movie, before going on to be the main villain of Legion of Superheroes. I was actually pretty glad when Brainiac returned for Legion of Superheroes, because the use of this hugely important villain as a minor villain in this movie, who is also killed by a bullet, was a bit of an underwhelming use of this character, although now that he has returned for Legion of Superheroes and was the main villain and had a non-negligible role in this movie, he kind of ended up being one of the most important villains in the Tomorrowverse, who died twice and despite being a Superman villain was never used in a Superman movie. The main villain of this movie is Charles Halstead, also known as the Advisor, as well as a mind-controlled Aquaman. Charles Halstead is the original Psycho Pirate in the comics, and until Kamandi is confirmed to take place on Earth 2, Charles Halstead is the only Earth 2 villain who's appeared so far. Although, with all the allusions to Crisis on Infinite Earths in this movie and Psycho Pirate's connection to that storyline, in combination with Halstead's mysterious disappearance at the end of this movie, makes me think he might not actually be from Earth 2 at all. Halstead hasn't appeared since, but is still alive, and I think he will appear again down the line. After Justice Society World War II would have been DC Showcase Adam Strange, however, all of the villains in this short are either cannon fodder Thanagarians, or cannon fodder alien insect thingies that are unidentifiable, so there isn't any villains to go over here, so let's move on to the first movie in this universe. And finally is Superman Man of Tomorrow, which introduced 4 Superman villains, none of whom have appeared since, but I do think some of them will. First of all, there's the main villain, Rudy Jones, aka Parasite, played by Brett Dalton, who's the only one of these 4 villains who died in this movie. The other 3 are still alive and will probably eventually show up at some point in this universe. There's Lobo, played by Ryan Hurst, who actually became more of an anti-hero by the end of the movie. There's Mercy Graves, who doesn't have any lines, and Lex Luthor. He's played by Zachary Quinto, and has had a surprisingly low-key role in the universe so far, for someone like Lex Luthor. So that is every villain who has appeared in the Tomorrowverse, but let's recap all of them by category. In Earth 1, the comic book Justice League villains who have appeared include Despero and Kanjaro. The comic book Superman villains include Lex Luthor, Mercy Graves, Lobo, as well as Parasite and Brainiac, who are both deceased, and probably Mongol in Justice League Warworld. The comic book Batman villains include Calendar Man, Two-Face, Holiday the Joker, Mad Hatter, the Penguin, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Killer Croc, and Killer Moth, as well as the deceased Carmine Falcone, Alberto Falcone, Sofia Falcone, and Sal Maroni. The Green Lantern villains include Arkillo, Lisa Drac, Parallax, and Sinestro, the two latter of whom are now dead. Villains who aren't really specific to any one hero in the comics or even the Justice League include, and this is only from Earth 1, Solomon Grundy, Lord Damon, Brainiac 2, Brainiac 3, Brainiac 4, and Mon-El, who is a hero, not a villain. Unconfirmed world, but probably Earth 1 villains include Ashox, Beelzebub, and Nergal. Earth 2 villains include Charles Halstead, and unconfirmed world, but probably Earth 2, is Zuma.